Hello, welcome back to my world of stuff. It is Saturday, November the 23rd, 2024. Can only mean one thing. It's Doctor Who's 61st birthday. Not a significant landmark. We had the 60th last year, which was all bells and whistles. But there's always a bit of a fuss in the Doctor Who community on Doctor Who Day. And I'm not going to be any different here today. So join me as I celebrate 61 years of Doctor Who. Will that do? Hello, welcome back. Yes, it's 61 years since that terrific Time Lord Doctor Who burst onto our screens. And yeah, I think I've got to celebrate it somehow, some way. And I think it's important to celebrate Doctor Who as it racks up these anniversaries. Doctor Who, 61 years young, still going strong, perhaps not in one of its imperial phases at the moment, but still out there, still popular, still a talking point. And what I thought I would do to quietly celebrate the anniversary was just do a little look back across the history of Doctor Who. Look back at all the Doctors, that's all 15 of them, and I'm just counting the Doctors rather than various different one-offs and offshoots and so on. No John Hurt, no Joe Martin, just the Doctors who had significant appearances on TV as the Doctor. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick my three favourite Doctor Who serials / episodes from the runs of Doctor Who. Now I was going to do this as one long video until I realised it was going to be about an hour long. So I'm going to split it into two. So today, for the anniversary period, I think it seems appropriate to restrict it to what's known as classic Doctor Who, 1963 to 1989. And in the video arriving tomorrow on Sunday, there's going to be the new incarnation of Doctor Who. I'm not going to call it New Who because that's stupid. It's all the same series. This is just a new extended version of the old series. So, if you like, the episode 2 tomorrow is going to be modern Doctor Who, 21st century Doctor Who. I'm going to pick my favourite episodes from all the Doctors we've had since the show came back in 2005. And I can tell you that's going to be slightly difficult. Not so much for the 9th and 10th Doctors, even the 13th to be honest, but for Matt Smith and Peter Capaldi, because those are episodes, most of them I've only watched once, a lot of them I can't really remember. So I've had to go back and look at the titles and remind myself of the episodes and to see which ones are my preferred of those two Doctors, because that's not a favourite era of Doctor Who. That Stephen Moffat era of Doctor Who I find frustrating and inconsistent, as some of you may know, because I have banged on about it quite a lot. So certainly for this episode, I think it's going to be nice and fun. I don't think anybody's got their guns out for classic Doctor Who. I don't think anybody's wildly opinionated about classic Doctor Who. I think when it comes to the modern series, of course, the Doctor Who wars are still being fought from people who hate Chris Chibnall, or hate Russell T Davies, or hate David Tennant, or hate Jodie Whittaker, or hate. I'm not interested in any of that, which I will talk about tomorrow anyway. What I just want to do today is have a nice half an hour or so just talking about my favourite serials from the classic era of Doctor Who. And what I'll say about both these videos, if you have an opinion on any of the options that I've chosen, remember, they're my options. These are my particular personal favourites. You may think that one or two of the ones I've mentioned here are complete pants. I just like them for reasons I'll try and explain. And if you disagree, that's fine. I don't mind you telling me you disagree, but let's keep it civil, eh? No F's and Jeffs, no swearing, no insults, because as I've said before, and I only ever have to say this on Doctor Who videos, those comments just won't make the cut and will be deleted, because I don't want that sort of stuff on this channel. I want to keep it nice and chummy, which it by and large is. But it is, unfortunately, it's only Doctor Who that has occasionally attracted some of the man babies who are, unfortunately, are a very vocal minority of Doctor Who fandom these days. But for today, we're just talking about classic Doctor Who. William Hartnell, right through till Sylvester McCoy, with all the ups and downs that era entails. And I'm going to talk about my three favourite serials. It's just my three favourites. I was going to do sort of the slight outsiders, the ones that nearly made the top three. I was going to talk about a bad one from each season, but let's be positive here. I don't want to talk negative about Doctor Who today, and I just want to pick on three particular favourites. These are the three for each Doctor that hit the spot for me. So, without further ado, let's start off with Mr. William Hartnell. So here we are, William Hartnell, the very first Doctor, 1963 to 1966, and I think it's very easy when people talk about and look back at William Hartnell episodes to just dismiss them as creaky old 1960s television with poor special effects. But I think that misses the point, that you have to look at the classic Doctor Who, certainly in the 60s, as products of their time, and as they were, extraordinary realisations of extraordinary concepts. When Doctor Who appeared on the screens in 1963, there wasn't a great history of science fiction television. We'd had things like the Quatermass serials, which were more aimed at adults, children, and had things like the Pathfinder series, but Doctor Who was the first series which was aimed across the board. It was never a children's series. It was always made by the drama department, and there was some dispute and arguments about that at the time. But Doctor Who was always an expression of ideas, and at its best it still is. So in 1963, when Doctor Who burst onto the screen with the TARDIS, this strange man who travelled in time and space, this machine that's bigger on the inside than out, it's just mind-boggling for audiences watching it back in 1963. So when looking at the serials of the 60s, yes, there are some ropey productions, of course there are, but you'll find that in any television of that era, or indeed of any era. I'm looking at the episodes of Doctor Who which had the most impact on me as stories, and occasionally stories which are important in the ongoing developing narrative of Doctor Who. So my third place, William Hartnell's serial, out of all the serials that he did across his 3 years, is, interestingly, curiously perhaps, The War Machines. This serial was from the end of William's third season. He did 2 serials and into season 4 because of ill health he left the series. And The War Machines is an interesting one because it's a very modern story, and that's why I've picked it. Watching it now, and I watched it not long ago, and if I'm very much mistaken, I've done a video on it back further down the channel, so go and have a look what I thought of The War Machines. It's a very modern story, even now, in the sense that it was being modern in the 1960s. It was the Doctor back on Earth properly for the first time, I think, since the very first story of Doctor Who, because in those first 3 years, very rarely landed on contemporary Earth. It was always out and about in space or in the future. Very few stories were actually set on modern day Earth. In fact, I think this was the first one since the Planet of Giants in season 2. And this is a really good story because it is very modern, and in some ways it lays that template for what was to come in the 70s. It's about a scientist operating at the top of the newly opened post office tower who is engineering a plot with a computer system to take over the world by a linked computer system. Very high-tech, very futuristic, very ahead of its time, as Doctor Who so often was. Written by Ian Stewart Black, it's a very scientific-based story, albeit in sort of woolly TV science, with computers and machines and that sort of early talk of AI. And it is quite remarkable how prescient it still is. What I like about it, though, is all the modern things that it does. It's really fun to see William Hartnell walking on the streets of London. William Hartnell walking into the Inferno nightclub to meet up with Dodo, his companion. The new companions, Ben and Polly, who were introduced, who are very much hip 1960s kids. She's a good time girl, in a good way. Party girl, likes nightclubbing and dancing, and Ben is this disillusioned sailor who's been left behind, and they get involved in the Doctor's adventures. And it's very modern. It's got lots of location filming in London. It's got the military, which was, of course, a big part of Doctor Who going on in the 70s. It just feels relevant. And Doctor Who, I think, it drifted a bit into fantasy, which it does occasionally. And I think that this was an attempt to yank it back and make it feel more modern and contemporary. And, of course, it's got great monsters. Well, robot creatures. It's got the War Machines, and I like them so much. I got 2 of them. They were a great creation, these things. Again, it's the classic Doctor Who thing, which became such an icon of the series later on in the 60s and into the 70s, of these creatures, robots, aliens, walking the streets of London. So many iconic images of Doctor Who. We'll come back to one of those a little bit later. So yeah, I got a lot of time for the War Machines. William Hartnell just gives a better performance here than he has for a while. I think he's bouncing off character actors like William Mervyn, who appears in it, and upping his game a little bit. And he seems to be enjoying himself a bit more. War Machines, very underrated. It's my third favourite William Hartnell serial. My second favourite William Hartnell serial is The Daleks, the second serial. Started at the end of 1963, Doctor Who's 5th episode, and then moved across into the new year, 1964, and started Dalek Mania. And I think it's not an understatement to say that without this story, and without the Daleks, Doctor Who wouldn't be here today. It would have burned itself out in a year or so, maybe, if it had got that far. But the Daleks, almost overnight, made it a phenomenon. I don't need to tell you about Dalek Mania in the 60s and what it led to, the films, the comics, the toys, this tide of merchandise that made their creator, Terry Nation, a very rich man. And it's one of his good scripts. I mean, Terry, I think, became a little sloppier as his career progressed. Certainly in things like Blake 7, he turned in scripts which were little more than a few pages. But here he crafted a 7-part adventure story, a great adventure story, set on an alien planet. The Doctor and his companions, Barbara, Ian and his granddaughter Susan, have arrived on this irradiated planet that's been blasted by a neutron bomb, again, ahead of its time, talking about that sort of nuclear weapon technology, to find that the Dalek creatures have mutated and taken to living in these robotic shells, and we know what the Daleks are. And the Thals who live outside, eking out a living in this blasted landscape, trying to bring themselves together with the Daleks to try and create a future for Skaro. But the Daleks, they want none of it. Anything that doesn't look like a Dalek doesn't deserve to live. And that's really a template for what the Daleks have been ever since. It's a really good story. I would say, if you're going to watch it, watch the 7-part original rather than that rather frantic, edited, coloured version which came out last year, which is interesting, but I think the 7-part version gives you the pace of the story. And yeah, it is a bit slow in places, but there's a real sense of the alien in the Dalek city. It's really well realised. And the Daleks, of course, are just a masterpiece of design. And of course, it went on to become the first Doctor Who film, Doctor Who and the Daleks, in 1965, with Peter Cushing now cast as the eccentric Doctor Who. So yeah, the Daleks come second in my ranking of William Hartnell serials. Number 1, it's Daleks again. It's the Dalek invasion of Earth. I thought about this, and I thought about the much regarded Hartnell historical serials, the Aztecs, the Reign of Terror, the Massacre of St. Bartholomew's Eve. But I like the Daleks. Dalek Invasion of Earth, I think, because it's the early version of the film, Dalek Invasion of Earth. Again, it's an important serial because it shows that juxtaposition of the modern day and something strange out on the streets. The Daleks patrolling over Westminster Bridge and around the streets of London in our location filming in the second episode. The Dalek rising out of the Thames at the end of the first episode. Iconic stuff, and still looks good today because it benefits from location filming, which Doctor Who hadn't done a lot of at that time, and some good performances, and a genuinely another exciting script from Terry Nation. The Daleks want to mine out the core of the Earth and turn it into a spaceship to travel around the universe. It's a ludicrous idea, but it's a fun 6-part adventure, and it's really well paced. It's good character work. Again, I don't know how much of that was the work of the script editor David Whittaker, how much Terry Nation penciled in his ideas, whether he wrote the whole scripts, but it's a really good adventure story. And again, some of the effects are a bit dated. You've got cardboard stand-up Daleks in the background to make up for the fact they only had 4 props. And the spaceship effect is a bit wonky, although there is of course a DVD version with slightly better special effects. But no, I just think it's a really good story, and it rattles along very well, and in a way it's an archetype, a Doctor Who archetype, the Invasion Earth story, which we had so many of later on. So yeah, it's my first Doctor rankings, and let's move along to Mr. Patrick Troughton, the second Doctor. It's difficult with Troughton because so few of his episodes exist. Well, so many of them were purged in the 70s by the BBC. Damn you, BBC! It's hard to pick out favourites when so many of what are regarded as his classic stories don't exist. And I'm aware, of course, that there are various reconstructions and computerised reconstructions and animated reconstructions. I've tried to focus as much as possible on the ones that actually still exist. And I think this is a list that would probably be slightly different if all the episodes existed and I could see them all. There are certainly a couple of serials I know which would be vying for position in this list, but I'm pretty much going by ones I've seen that exist in full, sort of. In third place, I'm putting The Web of Fear from 1968. This is the sequel to the previous year's abominable Snowmen story. Sees a very swift return for the Yeti, controlled and created by the Great Intelligence. And whereas the original Yeti in that first serial had been quite cuddly and bouncy, they were more streamlined and they look more malevolent and evil and deadly in this second serial. And again, this takes the Doctor and his companions, the Doctor, of course, Patrick Troughton, and his companions, Jamie and Victoria, to London Underground, where London has been evacuated because a strange web has been spreading across the city and robot Yeti are on the march. This, of course, is a story that didn't exist until a few years ago. I think we had episode 1 that was in the BBC archives, and then back in 2013, the remaining episodes were discovered by Phil Morris, who tasked himself with trying to find missing Doctor Who episodes. Bit of a mystery about this because, of course, he says he found the 5 missing episodes. By the time they got back to the BBC, there were only 4, and episode 3, which mysteriously is the first appearance of the legendary Nicholas Courtney as Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart, that episode didn't make the journey back to London. It's never been seen since. There are rumours that it's in the hands of a private collector, and it's frustrating that one episode of the story doesn't exist. But enough of it does for me to sort of say, yeah, this is my third favourite story. It's a great story. It's got that base under siege thing, which was a big part of Patrick Troughton's time in Doctor Who. People trapped in an isolated location with something outside trying to get in and infiltrate. always works very well, and they do it occasionally even now in Doctor Who. But this is one of the best examples of it. Again, it's out and about in London in certain scenes. There's a episode 4, which is the only one with significant amount of location filming actually, has the Brigadier, or Colonel Lethbridge Stewart, as he actually is in the story, he becomes the Brigadier later. He and a group of soldiers are around Covent Garden fighting off a group of advancing Yeti. And there's a really nice thing is this is directed by Douglas Camfield, who always did sort of military stuff really well. And there's this fantastic battle sequence with soldiers fighting Yeti and stunts and people flying about the place. Spectacular for Doctor Who in the 60s. And again, a lot of these stories are templates for my favourite era of Doctor Who in the early 70s, so it's probably why I've gone for these stories. As John Pertwee always said, there's nothing scarier than a Yeti on the loo in Tooting Bec. And it's the sort of idea that Russell T Davies has maintained over the years. Threats are much more terrifying if they're on your doorstep, if they're in the modern day. You don't really care about alien planets being invaded because they're alien planets. But when you've got Yeti marching around Covent Garden being shot at by soldiers and dead bodies covered in webs, it's visceral, it's close to home, and it works. It makes it more dramatic, makes it more exciting, and it makes it more thrilling to watch. Web of Fear comes in at number 3. Here's where I completely contradict myself in inexcusable ways, really. Having said that, I've gone for stories that exist in full. I've gone for number 2 in Evil of the Daleks, which only has 1 episode existing, episode 2. The rest have gone missing. And yeah, I could have gone for Tomb of the Cybermen. I did think of Tomb of the Cybermen. I even thought of the War Games, which I did a video on a little while back, because the War Games is a very underrated and very lavish and ambitious serial, which was created for a specific reason, and it's a good watch. A lot of the stuff from Troughton's 3rd series, which is where most of his stuff exists, is a bit lackluster. The Crotons, the Dominators, the Mind Robber, they're all a bit sort of, meh. And then looking back earlier, there's not a lot of stuff that exists. I mean, Fury from the Deep has been animated. Ultimately, I went for Evil of the Daleks because it is a classic Dalek story. It was the story that was designed to sort of write the Daleks out of Doctor Who, while Terry Nation, his foolhardy attempt to try and sell the idea of a Dalek TV series to the American networks. That was never going to work. 1 episode exists, and it's a great episode, and it has been animated. And I would say of all the animated Doctor Who serials that have come out over the last few years, the BBC, this is the best. This is very well animated, very thoughtfully animated. It's been directed. And I think sometimes with the animations, they look as if they've been animated without a lot of thought to camera angles and the dramatic impact of the staging of certain scenes. This, however, looks very good. It's got, again, that atmosphere of the Daleks in the modern day, Daleks in the Victorian era, the Daleks rattling through these corridors of this Victorian house. And I think the animation works well to support that. So I appreciate that in picking this serial, I've gone completely against what I said about only serials that exist in their original forms. But this is such a good story. I think it is such an important story that I think I have to put it in second. And I really would love to see the original version of this again. As the years go by, I'm beginning to accept that I probably never will. But the animation is a decent replacement for it. And if you haven't seen it, it's well worth checking it out. And my number 1, it again does have some animated episodes because there are 2 episodes missing. I'm going to go with The Invasion from 1968. An 8-part story written by Derek Sherwin, which brought back the Cybermen. The Cybermen had been a persistent presence throughout Troughton's era because they came into the series at the end of William Hartnell's time, and they became so successful that they kept coming back, redesigned. And I like the way that the Cybermen have always been subtly redesigned from those big clumpy things we had in the 10th Planet. They became more streamlined, and it really sold that idea of human bodies, or bodies that had replaced themselves with cybernetic parts. I think the modern Doctor Who's lost that element of it with the Cybermen. You forget that that's what they are, really. Converted humanoids that are turned into these creatures. And I think that although Invasion doesn't actually bring that up particularly well, again, it's another one of those stories which speaks to me of 1970s Doctor Who. It's the Cybermen invading Earth from the sewers. They're in a factory, there's pods full of Cybermen. There's a classic villain in Tobias Vaughan, played by Kevin Stoney. There's lots of modern iconography, lots of London location shooting, helicopters. UNIT make their first appearance. Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart, now upgraded from the colonel he was in the Web of Fear a few weeks before. This again is very much an embryonic version of what Doctor Who would become 2 years later. And I don't think when this was made it was necessarily designed to be that. But it certainly introduces lots of elements that were ideally suited to be picked up when Doctor Who was being reformatted for the 70s. It's a great serial. The Cybermen look great. I think I love the look of the Cybermen. I think this is my favourite Cyberman design. They look like machine men. They genuinely have that look about them. And the fact that they don't speak a lot. Of course, the classic scenes of them coming out of the sewers and coming down the steps of St. Paul's. I think the last episode is slightly anticlimactic because it set up this huge cyber invasion and then it sort of fizzles out off screen. But it's a really good, intense, fast-paced story. Great production, great performances from all the cast. And I think it's one that I do think of when I think of Troughton's Time on Doctor. I think of the Doctor, Jamie and Zoe and the Cybermen in 1960s London. The Invasion is my number one Patrick Troughton serial. Let's move into colour. Let's move to colour now, Mr. John Pertwee. Doctor Who, 1970 to 74. He stepped aboard the TARDIS when the show had been very close to cancellation because the ratings had dipped alarmingly in the last couple of years in the 60s. The BBC were taking the view that it had had its day. It had a good run, 6 years, but maybe it was time to sort of close the TARDIS door and think of something else. Unfortunately, they couldn't think of anything else for that Saturday night time slot, so they decided to give Doctor Who another shot in colour with a new Doctor, a new production team and a new look. John Pertwee came along and Doctor Who exploded again. It burst back onto the screens bigger and better than ever. And whilst the ratings for his first season sort of dipped towards the end, they picked up then when the show was retooled slightly and made a bit more family friendly in John's second season, because his first season is quite adult, and I'll come to that in a moment, because I'm putting third in my John Pertwee rankings The Green Death, 1973, classic story, filmed up the road from where I live at the moment. John Pertwee, the one with the giant maggots, let's just call it that. And of course, this is a great story, again full of hugely memorable action sequences. John Pertwee started to look particularly bouffant in this particular story, but it is such a memorable, exciting, well-paced six-part story with a great villain. You've got Boss, the supercomputer, you've got a sort of humanoid, you've got human thugs and villains for the Doctor to deal with, you've got units out in full force with the redoubtable Brigadier. It's all part of that cosy unit family that characterised a lot of John Pertwee's time as Doctor Who. One of the great standout scenes in this serial, and one of the reasons I picked it, is because it is a rare example of classic Doctor Who touching the Doctor emotionally. I mean, it happens all the time now. Ncuti Gat was in floods of tears week after week. The new series has often dabbled with the Doctor's emotional side, and I know a lot of people aren't happy with that, and I sometimes think, yeah, sometimes with the Doctor was a bit more distant rather than open and, honest about his emotions all the time. But The Green Death did it very well at the end when his companion Jo Grant, who'd been with him for 3 seasons, decided to leave him and get married to Professor Cliff Jones, played by the late Stuart Bevan. And it's a really nice, really well done scene. The Doctor, as he says, the fledgling flies a coop and he's given a champagne and he gets into the car and he just drives off into the distance. It's a great story anyway. I love all that stuff. The maggots are very well done. It's lots of action. And I think it's topped off by that beautiful, resonant moment of rare emotion for the Doctor in the classic series. The Green Death is my number 3. I'll tell you now for nothing. My number 2 and 1 both come from John Pertwee's first season. This is one of my favourite seasons of Doctor Who of all time. It's 25 episodes, 4 serials, and this is where Doctor Who has its big boy trousers on, I think. This is where Doctor Who becomes the closest it's ever been to an adult show. It takes its lead from Quatermass with these stories about mysterious alien invasions and strange conspiracies and weird scientific experiments. And Pertwee's Doctor is very Quatermass in these particular serials. Number 2 in my list is Spearhead from Space, which is John's debut serial. This has been repeated umpteen times. It's been released on various formats umpteen times. It's on Blu-ray because it's all on film, so it's one that could be beautifully presented in HD and it looked great. It's a classic story, and it really reinvents Doctor Who. It really gives Doctor Who a kick up the backside and says, it's the 1970s now. It's in glorious colour. John Pertwee looks fantastic in it. Unit are there. There's lots of action. The Autons. It's Doctor Who reborn, and you can feel it when you watch it. You feel this sense of newness about it, even now, 54 years after it was screened. It bristles with this excitement of being, Doctor Who, this is new, this is different, watch this. And people did. They flocked to it and they loved it. And it's a great story. It's endlessly rewatchable. I've seen it so many times. It's a classic serial with classic moments, great performances, and John Pertwee just nails it from the off. By episode 2, when he becomes the Doctor, he's in the hospital for the first episode. By episode 2, he becomes the Doctor as we get to know him across the next few years. Ace. My favourite Pertwee serial, though, is Inferno. It's the final serial of season 7. The criticism of season 7 is that the stories are too long. Spearhead is 4 episodes, then we have Doctor Who and the Silurians, Bastards of Death and Inferno. They're all 7 episodes long. So inevitably, they feel a bit padded, and they sag, and the viewing figures dipped. I think by the end of Inferno, they were down to about 5 million again, which is pretty much where they've been at the end of Patrick Troughton's time, which is why there was some retooling for the following season. But this is a great story. I mean, this is Doctor Who at its doomiest and most apocalyptic, as the Doctor investigates the Operation Borehole project, which is trying to find a new source of energy at the core of the Earth. But it brings up this gelatinous substance which, when it touches people, it turns them into werewolves. I think is the only way to describe the Primords. Not Doctor Who's finest hour in terms of monsters, because they look a bit silly, but I think they work because of the sort of radiophonic screeching sound that they're overlaid with, and that makes it work quite well. But that's just a part of the story. The most interesting part of the story, which I suppose could come across as padding, is when the Doctor finds himself travelling to a parallel Earth. And the interesting thing about this story is the Doctor's using the TARDIS, but he's using the console of the TARDIS. And this is something I remember quite strongly from the time watching it in 1970, because I'm that old. The idea of the console being brought out of the TARDIS. How did you do that anyway? With the doors and how... But it was just this fascinating idea of the Doctor hanging on to the TARDIS console and using that to travel to another dimension. And it's that other dimension where you get this real apocalyptic feeling, because the project there is much more advanced in this parallel world. Characters are all slightly different. It's this militaristic, totalitarian state. And the Earth is much closer to destruction. And I think it's episode 5 or 6, which has that stunning final sequence of the lava pouring towards all the characters who are in the Doctor's hut. It's a great story. John Pertwee's at his best here. He's fighting, he's jumping about, he looks great, he doesn't have his cloak and thing on. It's just a great story. I love it. It's so well put together. And yeah, 7 episodes. And yeah, there are places where you sort of think which would hitch up its skirts a bit. But generally, it's just a fascinating 7 episodes of Doctor Who. My favourite John Pertwee. There are lots of John Pertwee stories which are great. You've got the Sea Devils, the Peladon stories, Planet of the Daleks, Day of the Daleks nearly made the cut. But it's such a strong era. And having said I'm not going to talk about the also-rans, I just have, so apologies. But no, those are my 3 Pertwees. Tom Baker. Now, Tom Baker came along 1974. John Pertwee had been aboard the TARDIS 5 seasons. He'd made the show his own. He was the Doctor to a generation of children and adults. Tom Baker had a huge job in taking that part on, but he did it so easily and effortlessly by being a very different character. He had the look, the scarf, the hat, the boggly eyes, the teeth, the grin, the bohemian look, the great bohemian. And this is why I think that time Doctor Who had a great student following, because he dressed the way that students would often dress, in these sort of shabby chic clothes from charity shops. He had that sort of rumpled look about him. Plus, he genuinely, in his first 3 series, felt like an alien who had very little time for humans, really. He was very irascible. He had better things to do than fiddle about with human activity. And when he came across villains, he was contemptuous of them because they were wasting his time. And for his first 3 series, Baker was fantastic. He had that sense of the alien about him. He would be staring into space when people were talking. As Tom Baker himself has said several times, you felt that the Doctor had secrets. He was thinking about things that we don't understand, we shouldn't understand. And he felt like an alien, the way he dealt with people, the way he talked to people, and his dismissal of people when they died. I'm thinking of a scene in Pyramids of Mars where Lawrence Scarman has been killed, and the Doctor's quite dismissive of it. And Sarah Jane says to him, "Sometimes I don't think you're even," and he goes, "human." And it reminds you that, wow, this is an alien. He has different attitudes, he has different values, different beliefs, different priorities. And I think for 3 years, Tom absolutely nailed that. I've spoken before about how I think his performance slipped after that, when a different producer came in. You know, the history, of course, is that Philip Hinchcliffe came in to produce Doctor Who, did 3 fantastic seasons. The show was really popular, more adult than it had ever been. But because of that, it came under the watchful eye of Mary Whitehouse and her self-appointed arbiters of taste, who said it's too scary for kids. And the BBC caved in, replaced Philip Hinchcliffe and brought in a meeker producer, Graham Williams, who unfortunately allowed Tom Baker his instinct for comedy and clowning to take precedence, and he tended to become a bit more buffoonish. However, there were some great classics in his time, and at number 3 in my Tom Baker list is City of Death. This is sort of late period Baker, really, and he only had 1 season to go after this. This is a great story that came about by accident, really. I think another story called The Gamble with Time, written by David Fisher, who had written for the show previously. That wasn't working out, and Douglas Adams, yes, that Douglas Adams, who was the script editor at the time, he constructed the story of City of Death. I think the original idea was going to be some sort of scam in a casino in Paris. He changed it a bit, and he changed the dynamics of the story. The story actually does timey-wimey a lot better than Stephen Moffat ever managed when he was in control of Doctor Who. It's about an alien who's fractured in prehistoric time, and his fractured versions have been living all across time, working to come to the point in 1979 where they have the ability to change the past, to go back to the past, to change the disaster that splintered them in the first place. There's a lot of lovely location filming in Paris. Tom Baker and Lalla Ward are a delight. They were an item at the time, and sometimes you can see that, and sometimes you can quite clearly see where they weren't getting on, because theirs was a tempestuous relationship. But it's just a great story. The location filming is gorgeous. It's a clever story, a witty script, and it's late period Baker just getting stuck into it a bit more rather than just being a bit lazy. It's City of Death. It's a beautiful story. It's really clever. It's funny in a good way. It's not trying to make you laugh all the time. It is witty, and that's something which I say Doctor Who can be. But I think when Doctor Who tries to be funny all the time, it doesn't work. City of Death, 1979, a great story. My second Baker story comes from, in fact, it's the first story of his 4th season. It's the first serial produced ostensibly by Graham Williams, but I think that the previous script editor, Robert Holmes, was still involved at the time, which is why it has a feel for the previous season. It's called Horror of Fang Rock. This is the one you'll know. The Doctor and his companion Leela, Louise Jameson, they land on the rocks around a lighthouse which is shrouded in mist. Something strange is going on. It's isolated. Early on in the story, something has dropped out of the sky into the water. Luxury liner crashes nearby. And it's again a base under siege story with the Doctor, the survivors of the ship, and the crew of the lighthouse trapped aboard the lighthouse, and something horrible and alien is creeping towards them. Fantastic. This is written by former script editor Terence Dix, who delivers a doozy of a story here. It's really creepy. The location is extremely claustrophobic and atmospheric. There's some great performances from the likes of Colin Douglas, and it's just a good script. The dialogue is sharp and clever. Dix manages to make the supporting characters seem like characters, not just names on a page of a script. They have their own demons, they have their own secrets, and he weaves all this into this really creepy, atmospheric, late-night chiller of a story. The Rutan monster gets a lot of flack, but I felt it worked really well. This sort of green blob with fluffy tendrils hanging off it. I thought it was quite creepy. It's been CGI'd up in the recent Blu-ray set, and I don't think it looks as good, to be honest. My favourite Tom Baker story, you might well know if you've watched this channel in the past, there's a long video about it I did a couple of months ago. It's The Seeds of Doom. I won't say too much about The Seeds of Doom because there is a video about it, but I just love this story. It's the Crinoid, this giant plant creature, 2 pods, they travel in pairs across space from this alien planet, and they take over the life forms of the planet and transform them into Crinoids. There are 2 of these pods. One is destroyed in the Antarctic, the other one finds its way to the home of an eccentric plant fanatic, Harrison Chase, played brilliantly by Tony Beckley, and the Doctor has to stop it before it spreads its spores across the world. It's a great story. It's, again, hugely action-packed, again directed by Douglas Camfield, who had a real flair for this sort of pacey stuff. Lots of military stuff, lots of location filming, lots of powerful adult stuff in it. There's all this, there's a lot of fights, there's quite grisly stuff about the compost machine which Chase has in his outhouses that nearly kills Sarah and the Doctor. It's just a really well-paced story. It has a feel of 1960s adventure series as well. I'm thinking of that Avenger story, The Man-Eater of Surrey Green, which I think had a giant alien plant thing in it. I just loved it. And I think for me, possibly, the connection, thinking about it, is the Crinoids. It takes me back to things like Day of the Triffids, killer plants. I seem to have an affinity for killer plant type things. It's great. Now, the special effects, even today, still look really good. And I love the Crinoids so much. BBV Audio got the rights to certain Doctor Who monsters when Doctor Who's off the air, and they created a couple of all-new audio adventures featuring the Crinoids. And a few years ago, they were novelising them, and I got to novelise, this is a shameless plug here, I managed to novelise and expand a story called The Root of All Evil, where a Crinoid infests a farm in Yorkshire. It was a 45-minute audio. I expanded it a lot with new characters and scenes and stuff, and it came out in paperback a few years ago. Still available from bbvproductions.co.uk if you want to pick up a copy. It's a bloody good read. Anyway, Seeds of Doom. It's my favourite Tom Baker story. Time is rattling on, so I will bounce through the last 3 classic Doctors. This is where things get a little sticky, as Doctor Who, in the harsh light of the 80s, started drifting out of popularity post-Star Wars. People weren't so inclined to sit and watch Doctor Who's cut and paste Saturday Night Adventures when they'd seen Star Wars and they'd seen Close Encounters and they'd seen E.T. later in the 80s anyway. And Doctor Who started looking like the poor relation, which it always had been really, but it had always survived by the quality of the stories and the charisma of its stars. And I think when you get into the 80s, the show loses a bit of its specialness. If that's a weak word I can use. I think there's a certain magic about the first 4 Doctors, a certain charisma that they have, and a certain feel about those 4 eras, even Tom Baker's later eras. Those 4 actors had a special uniqueness about them. And I think when we got into the 80s with decent actors, but they didn't quite have that factor that the first 4 had. Peter Davison, a perfectly pleasant actor, very young at the time. I think he was 31 when he got the role. He did his best to be different to Tom Baker, because of course Tom Baker had dominated the show for 7 years. He doesn't have the charm, he doesn't have that sense of the alien that the previous 4 did have. But there were some good stories, and I'm picking the 3 which I think are his best. Third is Earthshock. This is from Peter's first season. This works. It's not a subtle story, it's not a clever story, but it brings back the Cybermen for the first time in about 5 years. And it does it really well. They're redesigned, they look sleek and sophisticated and deadly. They are in the hold of a cargo ship travelling towards the Earth in the future. They've already tried to destroy the Earth by use of a bomb. It's a big action romp. There's lots of battles and gunfights, and it's just good to see the Cybermen back. And Peter Davison himself does give a good performance in this. Earthshock is my third. I can't rave about it because I don't love it, but it is a good story. Now, number 2 is Enlightenment from Peter's second season, season 20. This is a very clever story, one of the few Doctor Who stories of that era written by a woman, Barbara Clegg. And this is a sort of a romantic story about a space race where the participants are all sort of Tudor galleons and space yachts. And it has that sort of Edwardian elegance about it, with costumes, lavish performances. There's a romantic lyricism about the script and the characterizations, and it feels slightly otherworldly because it's about these creatures called the Eternals who live outside time, and they just experience things through the experiences of others. And it has that sort of lazy sort of feel to it. But it's a nice production. I think that the original special effects are good. That's been updated on the new Blu-ray version. But it's a clever idea, and I think that's one of the things that always goes in Doctor Who's favour, that generally had really good ideas. And I think the idea of these sailing ships sailing majestically through space is a really good romantic sort of idea. Top, Davison, of course, is Caves of Androzani. What else could it be? Davison's finale, the penultimate serial of season 21, and this is Robert Holmes, the great Robert Holmes, back to write Doctor Who, firing on all cylinders with this fantastic story about the Doctor and his new companion Perry, Nicola Bryant, arriving on the planet Androzani Minor, where they get infected by this deadly Spectrox. And they're dying from the very first episode, but they don't know it. There's a battle going on between some gunrunners led by Sharaz Jek in the underground tunnels. It's very much a sort of a riff on the Phantom of the Opera, Magnus Greel type thing that Robert had done in the Tunnels of Wang Chang a few years ago. But the production is through the roof. This is directed by Graham Harper, who brought a real pace and energy to the series. It really rattles along. Really well directed, very atmospheric, very moody, and it's got that sense of doom all the way through it, whether it's because we know it's Davison's final serial or because it genuinely is doomy. It works as a production. It's very two-fisted, and it's got a very dramatic ending as well. The Doctor saving Perry's life, staggering back to the TARDIS, and then pretty much dying in her arms because there's not enough of the toxin to offset the effects of the Spectrox for the two of them, and he dies and regenerates into the next Doctor, Doctor number 6, Colin Baker. Now this is where things get really tough because Colin Baker had a really rough time on Doctor Who. He was sacked. He had a terrible costume, terrible personality. They started him off being almost a killer, trying to kill his assistant Perry. He was unlikable from the off, so he had a hell of a lot of work to do to try and win the audience around. I don't know if he ever did. And there were all sorts of issues going on behind the scenes at the time. BBC had fallen massively out of love with Doctor Who. They really wanted rid of it. Because new people had come in, they had new shows they wanted to bring to the screen, and this 21-year-old science fiction series would not die. So Colin had a rough time of it. Finding his 3 best stories is difficult. So I put at number 3 The Two Doctors from his first full-length season. It's not very good. It's Robert Holmes who's written it, so the script is very well written. But it's not very likeable. The villains, the Sontarans are back and they're not very well depicted, bearing in mind they're supposed to be a cloned race of sort of, not like dwarves, but sort of medium-sized men. Here they're played by men of different heights, so they don't look like clones. The masks aren't very good. You've got these quite nasty cannibal creatures called the Androgons. And this is one of the features of this particular part of Colin Baker's era. I think that Michael Grade, who sort of didn't like the show anyway, he did feel it would become nasty and there was too much violence and unpleasantness and the show had lost its way, and I think it had. But I think The Two Doctors is the final chance to see Patrick Troughton as the Doctor. He spars well with Colin Baker. It's nice to see Fraser Hines back as Jamie. It works as nostalgia rather than a decent story, and it's one I can watch and wish it was better. But it's a lot better than some of Colin's other stories, which I won't even ennoble by mentioning here. Second place, I'm putting Trial of a Time Lord, Part 1 to 4. This is the comeback season after Doctor Who had been put on hiatus. They'd had to revamp what they'd planned to do, and they came up with this 14-part Trial of a Time Lord scenario. Trial of a Time Lord Parts 1 to 4, often referred to as the Mysterious Planet, but not by me, because on screen it's called Trial of a Time Lord Parts 1 to 4, and that's what I'm going to call it, thank you. This is Robert Holmes's pretty much final script, full script for the series, and again, it's not one of his better scripts, but it is a nice script. There's nice characterisation, there's nice dialogue. The Doctor now is characterised, he's much calmer and much milder than he'd been in his previous series. There's much less overt violence and killing from the Doctor. And he and Perry have this sort of quite friendly relationship. They've landed on this planet, which it turns out to be his Earth in the future, when it's been devastated. There's a conspiracy going on with the Time Lord, which sort of runs for 14 episodes. Nice supporting performances, a couple of decent robots. It's not great, but it's a lot better than some of the other Colin Baker stories that the poor man had to deal with. And it's quite watchable for what it is. His best story then is going to be, again, just one I'm not nuts about. It's Revelation of the Dalek, the final story from his first full season. And of course, by the time this was aired, the series was already in some difficulty with the next season having been postponed. This is an odd one. It's Davros, it's the Daleks. It's part of that slightly dour feeling that whole season had. This nihilistic feeling of darkness and death. This planet of dead people, Necros. Davros is the great healer. He's creating new Daleks from dead bodies. It's all a bit grim and unpleasant. But there's some decent ideas. It's written by Eric Saywood. And it's very much, I think he was influenced by the fact that Earthshock he'd written a couple of years before, or a few years before, had been very popular. And he tried to do the same thing with the Daleks, with lots of death and lots of killing. But by the end, you're a bit exhausted and you sort of think, I quite like Doctor Who to be a bit more upbeat than this. It's okay. I think for Colin Baker, it's the best of a bad bunch, unfortunately. Then we come to the final Doctor of the classic series. It's Mr. Sylvester McCoy. Famously, I was never a fan of Sylvester McCoy at the time. He's a lovely man. I've spoken to him a few times. Really nice man. He's, of course, now one of the great ambassadors of classic Doctor Who. But I think he had a rough time because I think he was miscast at the time. Doctor Who at that particular period needed a Christopher Eccleston type who would shake the show up and make people think, this is Doctor Who, look how good this can be. Unfortunately, at this time, Doctor Who was a poison chalice across the entertainment industry. However, Sylvester McCoy came along. He was better known at the time as, I suppose, the bloke who shoved ferrets down his trousers. But he'd been on things like Vision On. He was a sort of a vaguely alternative entertainer. And I think I'm not going to do a diatribe about his era. I felt it was shoddy and shocking at the time. Now, in hindsight, I can see that Andrew Cartmel, the script editor, was trying to do something different. And again, if you look back at my recent review of the season 25 box set, I've talked about this. I think there were serious efforts to rehabilitate the series, but I think it was not well thought through enough to be a success. But there were a few good serials in Sylvester McCoy's time, which I now appreciate more than I did at the time. So in third place, I'm putting Dragonfire. This is the last serial from his first season. His first season is pretty shocking. You've got Time and the Rani, which is inexcusably bad. You've got Paradise Towers, which wastes a really interesting idea. You've got Delta and the Bannerman, which is pure panto. And then Dragonfire, which is actually redeems the season because it's quite a dark story about this obsessed madman on this ice planet who's kept this sculpture of his wife alive because he thinks he can resuscitate her. It's quite dark, it's quite creepy, and it introduces Ace, the Doctor's new companion, who would stay with the rest of the series. And it's quite well done. But it's not a great story, but it's entertaining and quite nice to watch. Greatest Show in the Galaxy was the last serial of McCoy's second season. This is actually very good. Watched this again recently as part of the new box, and this works very well. It bases itself on that thing of clowns and circuses being quite creepy and eerie, and it's a really nicely done story because of the nice location filming in this Dorset sandpit, which actually looks like an alien planet rather than a sandpit in Dorset. This psychic circus is there. There's some nice model work. There was an asbestos scare at BBC Television Centre, so they weren't able to use the studio. So John Nathan Turner, the producer, instead of abandoning 4 episodes of an already short season, remounted it by putting a circus tent up in the car park at L Street and filming all the interiors in this tent, which is sort of appropriate for the nature of the story. It's actually a good story. Ian Reddington is great as the chief clown, this sort of creepy clown who drives around in a hearse. And there's some interesting visuals. It's a good idea, and it's a story. It's a well-done story which takes little jabs at Doctor Who fandom and has a good time doing it. And it's quite good fun. The best story of McCoy's era, of course, is Remembrance of the Daleks, the first story of the second season, which is Doctor Who Reborn. And again, I've talked about this on the box set review, so I won't repeat myself here. But it's a great story. It's full of action and life. It's got an energy that makes you feel that Doctor Who is finding its feet again. It didn't find its feet properly, but occasionally in stories like this, it would flare into life. It's the best Dalek story since 1975's Genesis of the Daleks. Sylvester McCoy is good in it. He has a certain physicality about him that works here. And of course, you've got Ace famously beating up a Dalek with a baseball bat. And there's lots of great location filming, lots of action, lots of explosions. It's very reminiscent of the Pertwee Unit era, which is probably why I do enjoy the serial so much. This is a long video, so I hope you've persevered with it. And I hope you enjoyed it as well. So, yeah, please like and subscribe, leave a comment, and keep checking the stuff. And I'll see you tomorrow for part 2.